Hello and welcome to Northampton Community College's Ethics and Moral Problems course. This is Lecture 4, Ethical Issues, Abortion, and we will be talking specifically about personhood and autonomy. If I may, I do want to offer a few preliminaries. This, of course, is a hot-button issue, but philosophy is uniquely poised to address this. We're going to tackle this from a rational point of view, and we're going to apply principles of reason and argumentation. So you have a position on this topic, I'm sure, and I have a position on this topic. Some people may claim that they have no position on this topic, and therefore, by that, they are neutral and can look at this unbiasedly. I can't imagine anybody that has no position on this. So there really is no neutral position when it comes to some issue like this, abortion, or perhaps even what we'll talk about in the future, like immigration. Could you really imagine having no position on slavery? If somebody were to say that, I'd wonder if they think at all. So this issue of abortion, like others, is not about having a position. It's about the way that one comes to the conclusion. In other words, how we can arrive at truth and validity in our arguments, and then the ability to be reasonable in our conversations. So hopefully that'll be something that we can tackle here in this lecture tonight. Now, the first thing I want to say is that the terms pro-life and pro-choice, when we're talking about these hot-button topics, right, and if we want to apply principles of reason, the first thing that we have to kind of keep in mind is we don't want to get caught up in the slogans. It's not really good just to say, well, I'm pro-life or I'm pro-choice. It's not that you can't use those. I'm just trying to say that those slogans are inherently inadequate to really encompass the nuances of what these positions entail. And more often than not, they're really nothing other than what we would call rhetorical descriptors. So we're going to try to avoid use those. And we're also going to put aside any political affiliations. They're always inconsistent. To be pro-life, you could be against abortion, for the death penalty, and I won't go into the other ones. We could, but they just literally are inconsistent. And philosophy should always guard us against falling into some ideology. So we have to watch what drives that behind us, right? And we're also going to make sure that we don't just say I'm on one side or another. This is much more complex than that. So there are never just simply two sides. There's always varying positions that people hold, and then we need to be in dialogue. So it's this dialogue that we develop a mutual understanding for the other person, you and I, and you for me. And with this dialogue, we're going to kind of develop a framework that's going to help us discover truths that, in other words, if we didn't have this approach, just the fact that we might be on opposite poles of this could wind up being a hostility that doesn't really allow us to have a respectful exchange. And it really just thwarts the whole purpose of having a reasonable conversation. Again, that's the beauty of philosophical reasoning. It doesn't fall prey to the crap that we see and hear on the news and social media. Here we're not trying to win an argument. All we're trying to do is understand a little deeper and a little better. That way we can form more clear judgments. So anyway, when we tackle any issue like this, the first thing we have to say is, what exactly are we discussing? When we use the term abortion, we can't just assume that everybody knows what we're talking about. Now, we're going to leave out any discussion of spontaneous abortions. Those are what are typically called miscarriages. They may or may not have an ethical import. Of course, if they're caused by some physical abuse, self-harm, being thrown down the stairs, they involve drug and alcohols, poor choices, such like that. Then they could have an impact on the culpability, or what we call the guilt. But those are too nuanced for this brief discussion. So we're only going to be addressing here procured abortions, which really is to be understood as deliberate termination of a fetal life. Now, I know the American Medical Association will use the term pregnancy here, the termination of a pregnancy. That's been a recent adoption. And that's something to do with the morning after pill, because that type of contraception used to be labeled with a side effect as abortion, and that didn't really kind of play well. So what they did was they moved the idea of pregnancy from fertilization to implantation, and then they called that an established pregnancy. So we're going to kind of understand that, but we're just going to leave it at the deliberate termination of a fetal life. We're also not going to talk about the concept of ensoulment, like when the soul enters the body. It's not that that's out of bounds because it's just simply religious. It's perfectly fine to discuss in philosophy. It's simply that we cannot cover every aspect of this issue. And as good philosophers, we're going to try to base our evaluation and judgments on very clear terms. So I'm just trying to lay those things out for you now. Some of the terms that we're going to have to talk about here are going to include what it is to be human, a life, personhood, bodily autonomy, and things to that particular degree. Now, if I were to say to you, we're going to start somewhere, because what we're going to do is pretty much try to determine the two aspects that I began this lecture with, personhood and bodily autonomy. So let's talk about this idea of personhood. Most things in ethics begin with what's known as ontology, which is the study of being, and that just simply is to ask what a thing is. So if someone were to say to you, or if I were to say to you, in the next room, there is a being, a thing, and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to kill it. I would hope the very first words out of your mouth would be, well, what is it? Okay, the minute that you ask what it is, you're asking an ontological question. So if I were to tell you, well, it's a cockroach, you might say, well, no problem, go ahead and step on it. If I go and say, well, it's a rat, okay, well, maybe you'd be okay killing it if it was some, ugly New York sewer rat, but they make wonderful pets, so you might start questioning it if it was this type or level of being. If I told you, well, what is in the next room is a kitten, you'd say, well, no way, even if you're not a cat person, you'd say, I don't want anybody to hurt or be cruel to that. And if I were to tell you in the next room it was a human person, you would wonder why I'm even asking about harming this particular child. So in ethics, the first thing we need to do in a situation like this is determine what is this. So if we're going to ask a question about the ethics of abortion, we're going to have to determine what is this unborn being. So many people just kind of skip this step, but it's important that we stick to it. Now, a few side notes here are some people will tend to ask, when exactly is it become a life, and when exactly does this life become human? Now, these things really should not be controversial. Life begins at fertilization. That's really a biological question, and it's not really part of the debate, to be honest. When two haploid genomes condense and form a diploid genome, this is a new life. And it's a human life. It can't be anything else. It's not, a future human life, because that's not telling you what it is now. It's nothing other than a human. It's never going to turn into a giraffe or anything else. I'm not trying to be silly, just that the fact that it's a human life should be the things that we all accept. If someone were to say, well, it's not a life, or it's a human, or it's not a human, then they really are compelled to say, well, what it is now. Ontologically, can you answer that question? So for us, the issue is personhood, and that is squarely in the realm of philosophy. So we're going to talk about that. Now, in the United States, personhood, at least legally, is determined as far as the unborn to occur at birth. Now, you might be surprised to learn that philosophers, it doesn't matter if you're an abortion advocate or if you're opposed to abortion, most think that that's kind of an absurd notion, that it's just, an inside and outside. If unborn child, if the word child has any meaning, then the word unborn child should have some meaning. Before I move on, I want to give you some quick background, because we hear a lot of things about Roe v. Wade and such around the legal issues of abortion, but not everybody's really keen on exactly what that Supreme Court ruling determined. So, okay, the famous precedent that came from Roe v. Wade. First of all, Henry Wade was the Attorney General for the state of Texas. Now, the Roe was a generic name for a woman named Norma McCorvey, who really had no idea that she was Jane Roe. So this was argued on her behalf without her knowledge by her lawyers and other powers involved. So the ruling overturned any state laws that prohibited abortion in the first trimester. And there were other provisions, but it basically linked viability, in other words, when a child can live outside the womb, to potentiality. So that's when it became a human. So judges, they're not really philosophers, or that probably would not have happened. There would have been too many questions that were brought up. But this used an extrinsic understanding of personhood, so it was out of the womb, a person. Now, you may or may not know that the same day that Roe v. Wade was determined in Texas, on that day in Georgia, there was another case that was Doe v. Bolton. Now, the Doe was Sandra Cano, who also didn't know that the case was being filed on her behalf. She did find out in 2003. This case contained what is known as the health clause issue. So when one uses the term life of the mother, in other words, some people might say, well, I'm for abortion except in case of the life of the mother. We think, again, that that term simply means, well, this woman will die. But that's not how they determine it. What they ruled was that the medical judgment may be exercised in light of a lot of factors. So life of the mother did include the physical life, but it also included her emotional life, psychological, familial relations, the woman's age, how relevant this is to the well-being of the patient. So it legally allowed abortions not pretty much in all trimesters. But I'll let you go and look that up if you want to, anything more about that. And today, it's like another thing that I'm not going to talk about, but you might be interested in looking up on your own, is something called partial birth abortions. It's where the baby is turned, breech in utero, and then the body is outside, the head is brought outside, and then the termination is performed that way. And it's been deemed illegal except in the case of the life of the mother, but again, we'll have to determine what the life of the mother is. But this isn't a law class, and I'm not here to go over all those things. I just thought since we are speaking about them, you should have at least some awareness of those when you are trying to make determinations on the judgment on this ethical issue. All right, so we talked about life, and we also talked about the fact that it could be nothing else than a human. So if we're going to try to determine personhood, we have to ask ourselves, what are the choices? You know, at what point along the maturation of the unborn child or born child will we determine personhood? Now, I'm not trying to be exhaustive here, but there's at least things here for you to consider. So the first one would be fertilization, and this is, again, when the two haploid genomes condense. Is that the beginning of personhood? Another option would be heartbeat. Now, heartbeat is around 6 to 7 weeks of gestation. Brain activity, it really depends on what we're considering activity here. I mean, there is electrical activity in and by the 5th week, and further development of the cerebrum by week 10. Movement, this has in the past been known as quickening. It usually occurs around 16 weeks or so. Pain sensitivity, this is somewhat controversial because neuron development does occur around 6 weeks of gestation, but published studies make it very clear that by 20 weeks the baby can and will feel pain, and if an abortion is to occur at that time or later, the child, unborn child, should be given some sort of sedative. Viability is whether or not the child could survive outside of the mother's womb. So it could be 20, 22, 24 weeks, but the fact that a child might be viable at that age doesn't mean or guarantee its survival outside the womb. Of course, the percentage goes up from like 35% around 22 to 24 weeks up to 90% if another 4 weeks are added after that. This is the legal definition, at least, is that when the child is born. Now, even born has to kind of be defined. So what they really mean is when the head is outside of the vaginal cavity, or if it's breached to the point of the unborn's navel has reached the outside. And again, I'm not going to cover partial birth abortion here. You can look that up to determine exactly how this works out in those particular situations. Now, another consideration that you might not have thought of is self-awareness. Now, this is the point where the child is aware that they are distinct from the world. That is, they're aware of their own self-existence. This is not usually until 5 or 6 months post-utero. So this would be what we would legally call infanticide. Now, the reason why we have to work through these things is because to assign personhood to one of these conditions, you have to have some justification. Why did you choose that? In other words, if we're going to become persons when our heart beats, if that's what you think, why do you think that? You know, you might say, well, isn't that when we declare a person deceased? In other words, when their heart stops, we declare them dead. Well, then, if that's how you think you should apply your principles, you know, then you're down into the 6-week realm. You have to work that out. If you were to say viability, you know, in other words, as soon as a child could live outside the womb, I think that's when it's a person. Well, just realize that's going to change in the future. It is currently at roughly 22 weeks gestation, but that's going to go lower as technology allows medical intervention in earlier stages. And, you know, who knows, in 30 to 40 years, it could be likely that we have developed artificial wombs. And once we have an artificial womb, then viability is pretty much at any given time, provided the technology is there. So that wouldn't even be an issue anymore. Now, you might have been a little taken back by self-awareness. In other words, why would we think a 5 to 6 month-old child post-utero, who would ever think such a thing? Well, the Princeton ethical philosopher Peter Singer, he's an advocate for this self-awareness. In other words, until the infant is aware of their own existence, then they're not really yet a person. I mean, what are they? They don't even know who they are. And since that occurs 5 to 6 months post-utero, even though we consider this infanticide, and it sounds horrible, if we're going to be consistent, isn't this the sort of criteria that some people use for patients, say at the other end of our lives, in the comatose state? Think about it. Sometimes when people are in the permanent vegetative state, we use language like they're not really there. In other words, the person that we used to know as Tom or Tammy, they're really no longer Tom or Tammy. That's just their body. So even if that seems a little crass to us, it is being consistent. And that's the point. The point is to be consistent in your philosophical approach to when a human life is determined a person, and then apply this principle for person in the case of abortion to end-of-life issues. Perhaps that would be an exercise to help you. Now, that doesn't just solve it. One might argue further, well, but at the end of the life, there's other things to consider. They now have a full life that they've already lived. They have collective memories, and they have relations, and all that must be considered. Maybe. But should something subjective like that determine personhood? How many relations we have, how many memories we have? Are you less of a person if you're only 1 year old because you haven't really developed those things yet? Anyway, those are things for you to work out as far as determining personhood in this issue. Now, the issue of bodily autonomy, this is another consideration. The woman will likely carry, what you should have first determined ontologically, we'll say the unborn, for 9 months. And I want to immediately set two considerations aside in this, and I'm not trying to skirt them. I'll explain why briefly. One is the case of rape. Okay, so this is a horrible, violent act, but it is an exception. And for us to focus on this exception is not, first of all, it doesn't really determine the ontological status of the unborn. But often in the two-sided debate, as we see in the political sphere, this becomes the bargaining chip, right? So neither the pro-life or the pro-choice advocates would ever concede everything else if this were dealt with. So I think sometimes people bring this up just because they want to muddy the waters. And again, it's a very serious thing, so I'm not downplaying it. And as a side note, as far as incest, really has nothing to do with this issue per se. Incestual rape is simply that, rape. You might say, yeah, but is there incestual relations that aren't rape? Of course there is. There are always challenges to sanguinity laws in marriage and such. So if it is non-consensual, it's rape. The relationship between the two individuals doesn't really change the ethics of it per se. It does affect the circumstances, I admit that, right? So anyway, if we're going to say that a woman has right to her body, then we're going to have to say, how do we define bodily autonomy, right? Is it without exception? We would call this the sovereignty position, and that is one option. And if that's your position, then you have to work out how does this play in other areas in our lives. In other words, we have a lot of issues with people who may or may not want vaccinations. In other words, should we have mandatory vaccinations? Well, if you believe that a person should have mandatory vaccinations, then how does that fit in with the sovereignty position on here? In other words, someone might say, well, but it's a little bit different, right? Because in the case with vaccinations, if you don't get vaccinated, you could get a disease and spread it and other people will be harmed. But wouldn't that really be saying that the right to one's body does not extend to the harm of another person? Because that would be one way to say it, correct? And if we start making that consideration, then we're going to have to go back and say, well, could we sell an organ? In other words, if my body is sovereign and I can do what I want, then I should be able to sell an organ, which right now is illegal. Or, of course, presently there is also a law against that. So to be consistent, to say I want a sovereign exception for all things, if that's the proper way to say it, then you have to at least, or should support that to be consistent. Another facet of this is to determine how is the relation of the woman to the child in terms of bodily autonomy, right? In other words, nobody will question that the fetus is not somehow a part of the woman, but is it a mere part? And even if it is a part, what does that relationship entail? If the woman has entire sovereignty over her body, then the unborn has no claim on the development within the woman's womb. Though this position still has to resolve the issues that I mentioned previously about vaccinations, organ donations, and etc. But you also will have to talk about the ontological aspect of the unborn, because if the unborn is determined to be a person, then that body itself should have sovereignty. So I'm just trying to give you the stuff to help you work through this. The other aspect of bodily autonomy, besides sovereignty, is we could talk about the right to refuse. In other words, the woman would refuse to have the womb be the location of development for this child or unborn fetus. This is the Judith Jarvis Thompson sick violinist argument. Now, I'm not going to rework or reproduce that entire argument in this lecture, but I'd like you to consider that and think about how you would apply that in terms of bodily autonomy. Keep in mind that you still need to resolve the ontology of the unborn. But that being said, it's still an argument that's worth your consideration. So anyway, there's much to cover in this issue of abortion, and I didn't mean to be exhaustive. I only hope that this helps somehow in your evaluation. What I do ask, though, is regardless of what side, even that's a bad word to use, which side you might be on, to try to consider this issue in its entirety in all these various aspects that I've offered you today. Some people think the issue is complex, and it is, right? And some people think, well, this is controversial, and it is. So they leave it as complex and controversial, and rather than work through the rational process of forming a principled judgment, too often people just fall back on the default positions. But as philosophers, we have to bring ourselves a little farther than that. Well, thank you for listening.